This presentation is on traditional oral language and storytelling in Alaska. Language in any culture is an important part of keeping track of history, teaching, and entertaining. It's important to one's identity and helps tie families and communities together. It helps people track their origins and brings unity to those who share dialects that make each group feel unique and yet part of a whole. When languages are lost, so too is culture. This can create a sense of detachment from one's past and can make it difficult for people to know who they are, where they came from, and where they fit in. It can create a sense of guilt and shame and can cause pain and trauma that lasts for several generations. Many Native Alaskans know this trauma all too well and have suffered the ill effects of the loss of culture and language for far too long. In Alaska, there are two major language families. The Eska-Aleutian language is separated into Aleut and Eskimo, which is further divided into three Yupik languages and Inupiaq. These variances in language occurred several thousand years ago due to separation and isolation of groups. As with any language, further separation of groups creates additional dialects from one group to the other. Each group shares stories, history, and teaching practices that are culturally important, yet many of these languages and dialects have disappeared and many more are in danger of doing the same, with only a few elders knowing and fluently using them today. The loss of these languages has been a personal blow to many Indigenous people because it also means the loss of culture, worldview, and identity, all of which were expressed through oral language and traditional stories. The loss of many native Alaskan languages occurred with the introduction of Russian fur traders, religious missionaries, and an educational system that discouraged Indigenous language and culture and insisted on the use of the English language that was more dominant. Many missionaries and educators even went so far as to insist that parents, families, and communities only speak English at home, making communication between children and others difficult or even impossible, and creating confusion and shame for everyone. These policies, no doubt, were set in place to completely destroy these cultures by extinguishing the identity of the Indigenous people, not only in Alaska, but throughout the United States. The loss of language, cultural identity, self-expression through traditional song and dance, and storytelling was the goal of those who took and maintained authority over these people. Yet many of these groups managed to hold on to these traditional practices, even in the face of opposition, thus maintaining their identity and culture. With resistance came policies that have helped to preserve some of these languages and cultures, and with these, some of the storytelling traditions that have been passed down from one generation to the next. These stories have been an important part of life for Indigenous people because they help them maintain their way of life by passing down knowledge and understanding. These stories tie into the subsistence life ways that many Alaskan natives still survive on today. Some of these stories include how and when to hunt and gather, and pass generational beliefs that people, animals, and the land are all at one. They teach of respect and coexistence between people, animals, and the land, and define how to best use and preserve what nature provides. They also teach of the consequences that can come when respect is not given. This knowledge is proving to be important in today's understanding of the ecological systems in Alaska. It often puts science and native ways of knowing at odds, with those who know and live off the land contesting that they have a much more intimate understanding of the land and animals than do those who come in and study these things for only a short period of time each year. The oral stories, or the traditional ecological knowledge that is passed down from one generation to the next, often yield more reliable data. While modern scientists and Native Alaskans agree that global warming is changing the face of the planet, especially in the colder regions of the far north, they are often at odds with the way in which the world is affected. Science tends to separate the planet from people, while indigenous stories tell of a connection between the earth and those who rely on her for survival. While science and oral stories tell the same story of the even flow of glaciers, science relies on data from ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, and glacial deposits, whereas traditional ecological knowledge uses narratives to explain the same phenomena, using actors that help explain the same outcome. These narratives also play an important role in today's ecological debate about animal migration patterns and numbers. In a report written by Jessie Ford for the Oregon Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, she explains that the data recorded by science about the number of remaining bowhead whales, estimating some 2,000 to 3,000, is very different from the numbers observed by the Inuit hunters who have a better understanding of the migration patterns of these animals. Because science is limited to tracking migration patterns in traditional paths, and because these paths, or leads, tend to close as ice packs move, they can easily miss the fact that migration paths also move. These changes in migration patterns are more easily tracked by the Inuit hunters, who also change travel and hunting paths for the same reasons. People of the area who rely on subsistence share hunting stories. They are better able to track the movement of the whales and have a better understanding of the actual number of animals that do exist in the area. This is not the only instance where science and indigenous residents have been at odds with the number of animals that are in an area. Again, it's the oral storytelling from one hunting group to another that has helped set the record straight. In Burro, Alaska, where the Inupiat hunters rely heavily on polar bears for subsistence, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services have attempted to place these animals on the threatened list and have sought to limit the number of bears that the residents can hunt, or even stop them from being hunted at all. Cameron Smith, who visited Burro, heard firsthand the oral stories of the people who lived there and walked away with a better understanding of how the traditional ecological knowledge of the residents there is more reliable than the data gathered by science. The information that is passed from one hunting group to another has been and remains today a very important part of traditional storytelling that helps Indigenous people maintain and preserve their subsistence way of life. These stories are not only important in traditional hunting practices, but they are also an important way in which these traditions are passed down from one generation to the next. Storytelling was and still is a very important way to teach younger generations how to survive in the same manner as those who pass down this knowledge. With the introduction of Western education and the more dominant form of storytelling as being less hands-on and more hearing and listening, many Indigenous children have lost the traditions of storytelling being used as active lessons. In an attempt to revitalize traditional storytelling in Indigenous populations, school intervention programs have begun to utilize these same storytelling practices in education. This means making storytelling less of a listening activity and more of a performance activity. With traditional storytelling, listening was concurrent with daily life activities. Understanding was measured in one's ability to perform a task that was related to the story at hand, such as making a canoe or hunting and gathering food. This non-verbal display of understanding yielded a more holistic and less immediate response and more effectively displayed understanding. In today's storybook intervention programs, this same storytelling approach is being utilized to help students connect with their native roots and create opportunities for adult-child interaction. While educators grapple with language and cultural inclusion in the classroom, they must also be respectful to the desires of those that they serve. They must also respect that bilingualism does not only take place in formal educational settings, but also in family homes, between generations, and communities. While it's the job of the educator to recognize student identity and include this identity in the educational setting, they must also remember that these ties to language and tradition, including the tradition of oral storytelling, is not limited to the classroom. It's part of a broader community that the student belongs to. These storytelling traditions serve to teach one's history and place in the world. They pass down knowledge from one generation to the next as they teach traditional subsistence ways. They also help create a sense of pride in one's cultural identity and helps preserve this identity for the next generation and generations to come. These social and spiritual storytelling experiences help Native Alaskans make sense of the world around them and help them cope with the changes that have become part of life. It creates a sense of unity among families and communities and teaches that there is no shame in accepting who one is and where they come from.